Yes, so we're talking about CSS syntax, and essentially how we write CSS is, first off, we have a selector. So the selector is what element we are trying to style in our HTML. So we have that, then we open to curly braces, then we write the property and the value. So what exactly we are trying to do. So we spoke about the various types of selectors that we can use. The first one was element selectors. And our element selectors are essentially the elements we have in our HTML. So we can pick that and use that to directly style them. So for example, we have paragraphs, we have H1s, we have spans. So we can target those ones by using the names of the elements as our selector and then giving them some styling. The other thing we spoke about was class selectors. And sorry, I'm just taking it slow so that we can understand. The next thing we spoke about was class selectors. So we said when we did attributes, we spoke about how we can give attributes to our HTML. So essentially, we can use the classes that we give our elements to style them. So if we give a class to something, we can use the class name to style it when it comes to our CSS. And the last thing was ID selectors. Again, when we spoke about attributes, we said we could give our elements IDs. So we can use the same IDs that we give the elements to style them. So the three main ways, there are the three primary ways you can style elements is by using the element selectors. So use the name of the element, and then you give it the styling you want. You can also use the class you have given it and use that to style. So this is an example of how we will style an H1. So this being the selector. So our selector here is an H1. So our selector here is the H1, then our property being color, then the value we want to give it. The one thing we also said is that our properties are already specified in CSS. So we have a lot of properties. We have like color, font size, and all those things. Another example is our paragraph. So we could target our paragraph, we could give it a color, and we could style it black. So this is how you use the selector, the property, and what value you want to give it. So the property, the value, the selector, the property, the value. Another thing we spoke about is, like we said, CSS is cascading style sheets. What that essentially means is that CSS is read from top to bottom. So it means that something at the bottom can override something at the top. The example we gave was, if we have a paragraph and we have targeted the paragraph and we've given it a color red, and we target the same paragraph again at the bottom of our page and we give it a color blue, our final color will be blue because this will override this. So cascading means that it's read from top to bottom. So something at the bottom can override something at the top. Now we spoke about other ways by which we can target elements to style them. We spoke about parent-child direct descendants. So if we have a parent, which being this section, and this section has a child, which is the paragraph, we can target this paragraph by using the greater than sign. So what this selector is saying is that this section has a child, sorry. What it's saying is that this section has a child, which is a paragraph, and that is the paragraph that we are targeting to style. So it has a direct child, which is a paragraph. When we say it's a direct child, it means it comes inside of it immediately. It's not nested in something else. So in this example, this paragraph is a direct child of this section. And one way we can target the paragraph is to use the direct descendant, and we specify that by using the greater than sign. We also said that we could do parent-child. So parent-child, the difference between the parent-child is when it is an ancestor. In our previous example, when we say it's an ancestor, it means that no matter how deeply nested it is, we are looking to find, it has to be a direct child, sorry. So we are saying that this is a direct child. But then the difference between a parent and a child is that when we leave this space, we're saying that regardless of where it is, so it can be deeply nested, it can be nested within another section, but we're saying that as long as there's a paragraph within this section, we want to target that. So when we have the greater than sign, we're saying that it has to be a direct child, so it has to come directly within it. But when we leave the space, we are saying that we don't care if it comes directly in it or if it is the child of another parent, as long as that paragraph is in that section, that's the one we want to target and style. We also spoke about selecting by sibling. So sibling is essentially when we use the plus sign, we're saying that we want to target whatever element is directly next to the one on our left. So in this example, we have 2 paragraphs. So when we use the plus sign, we're saying that we want to style this. The way we can know this is the one we are looking for is that it's directly next to a paragraph. So if we look in this example, we have a paragraph which is next to a paragraph. So PE plus P will mean that this is the one that we are looking to start because it's the sibling. So we're looking to start a sibling. Again, you don't always have to use the relationships. It's just something good to know. Most times, if you can use your classes and your element selectors, you should be fine. But I mean, if you need more understanding of this, you can go back to the previous class. We spoke extensively about this. Okay, so before we go into today's things, does anyone have any question? Okay, I guess no question. So, I mean, if you don't understand anything, I mean, refer back to the old video, but just to quickly show an example from last class, let me open up VS Code. Sorry, I'm opening up an example just so that I can quickly show how you would do this. Great. So these are some of the examples we went over in class, but just to, since a few of us were not here, I guess most of us here weren't here on Tuesday. So I'll just quickly go over them. So if I can open this in my browser. Okay, so the way, just for it to make sense, I'll just get rid of all of this. Okay, so just to see an example of how styling works for anyone who wasn't here. In this example, we have an H1 and we're saying that we want to make this H1 a color of blue, have a background of underline. So I'll just quickly run through all of this. Yes, go. So I'll just quickly run through this. So in this example, we have an H1. We're saying that we want to make an H1 blue. So the way we do it is, we said we can directly use the element. So in this example, we have an H1. So I'm putting it here just so that I don't have to keep going back because I don't remember. So we have an H1. We're supposed to make this H1 a text of blue. So this is the selector being the H1, the property being the color. Then we give it whatever we want to give, in this case, blue. Then we said we'll give it an underline. And then again, you might not know this property, but when you watch last class, but we learned that there's a property called this text decoration, which we can use to underline stuff. Then it says background of gold. So gold. So if we save this and we look in our browser, we expect to see that the H1 will have the styling. So if I refresh, we can see that H1 has the background of gold and it has the text of. So that is an example of how you would target it. Now, this is the way you use an element selector. You could still use a class selector. So for example, if we wanted to use a class selector, we'll give the H1 a class. We'll give it a class of maybe, classes can be any name. So maybe we can call it heading. Then we said that to be able to use classes, you always start with a period. So we do that and we type the name of our heading of our class. So if we save this, we expect to see the same styling should still apply. Oh, sorry. So I gave it a class just to show how you can also use a class. So I gave it a class. I called it heading. Then in my styling, I changed it to heading. So the way you use a class is you start with the period, then you type the name of your class. So if we look in the browser, we should still see that it's the same thing. So that's the way you start with either elements or classes. And just to quickly show how you would do the same thing with an ID. Again, we can give it an ID. And we said that IDs, I'm using the same names. We said ID starts with a hash. So we will do like this. And if we check in our browser, we should see the same thing. So when I refresh, so essentially, those are the different ways you can target elements to star. Hopefully, if you don't understand anything, hopefully when you watch the previous class, it'll make sense. But then the way we can do that is by directly using the name of the element. So in this case, an H1, or we could give it a class, or we can give it an ID. All depends. Most times, if in this example, when we did it in class, we just use the element selectors because it's just one of each. So it made sense to just use them. But for example, if I had multiple H1s and I wanted them all to be different colors, I would give them classes, because then if I had one H1 and I start the H1, it means that all my H1 will have this color, but then I want some H1s to have different colors. In that case, it will make sense to give them different classes. Yes. So just to jump into what we have for today. Today, we want to talk about the box model. So the first thing you learn is that in CSS, everything is a box. In CSS, everything is a box. What that means is that when we are laying out our documents, the browser sees everything as a rectangular box. So everything you put there, when we put a paragraph there, our browser sees it as a rectangular box. And just to show you how that works, let's use this H1 we have. So since I removed the ID, let's have this H1. Now let me just give it a border so that we can see. So a border, 3 pixels, solid black. So I'm just giving it a border. A border is just a marking around it so that we see how it renders H1. It's new share. Okay, so when I refresh, you can see that there's a rectangular box around it. And essentially what this is saying is that whenever we have any element on the page, the way our browser sees it is that it sees it as a box. So the way our browser looks at it is that it is a box, it is a rectangular box. So every element we see here, the way our browser is looking at it is that it is a rectangular box. So when we talk about the box model, essentially what it means is that, and if I can make this, what it means is that every element is a rectangular box and there are several properties that determine the size of the box. Each part of the box corresponds to a CSS property. So back to this example, every element is a box. So this is a box. And the way the box is that it has 4 different properties. I mean, I'll just spew it, then we'll explain what each of them means. So we have a margin. Okay, so we have the margin, we have the padding, we have the width and the height. Now, just so that it makes sense, maybe I should have a new browser so that I don't keep going back and forth. So just so that it makes sense, the first thing we'll look at is, let's look at this H1. So I'll get rid of everything else just so that, I mean, we don't need it for now. So we have an H1. So what we are saying is that the browser sees our H1 as a box, and our box has a margin. I hope I can spell. It has a padding. It also has width. It has a width, and it also has a height. Now you may ask, what is the margin? What is the padding? What is the height? Now the first thing you learn is that the margin is the space around the box. So in this example, in our box that we have, our margin is, and let me refresh since I got rid of everything. So our margin is all the space that we have around this box. That is our margin. So every box has a margin around it. So it has, the margin is what is creating the space. As you can see, our box is not touching the very top of our browser. There's some space around it. The space around it is what you call a margin. Now, inside the box itself, you can see that there's a little space. The make is not touching the bottom of the box, and the make is not touching the top of the box. That is what we call the padding. So the padding is what's the space inside the box itself. So the padding is the space around the box. The margin is the space around the box. The padding is the space within the box. Then you have the content itself. So because everything is a box, and when you come into your inspector, we spoke about the inspector the last time, you can see. So if you can see, this is how your browser is looking at it. So this is our content. This is the make this text blue. This is it. Now around our box, there's a padding. So the padding is the space inside the box itself. So we can see our padding. Now we also have the border. The border is the lines around our content. So this is our border. Then we have the margin. The margin is the space outside of our box. So this is what is creating the space outside our box. So essentially, when we say box model, it's just that everything we write, our browser sees it as a rectangular box. Now we can use our padding, our margin, our border to position how we want to see. So for example, if I went into the code and I give this a margin. So we said margin is the space around the box. So if I give it a margin of 30 pixels, what I'm expecting to see is that the margin around the box should become, the space around the box should become bigger. So if we refresh our page, we can all of a sudden see that the space around it has become bigger. Now it's bigger. Maybe to make it more visible, let's give it a ridiculous margin, like maybe 3,000, which is too big, but let's do maybe 300. So as you can see, the space around our box has become bigger. So we said the margin is the space outside of the box. So because we gave it a 300 pixel margin, we can see that now the space around it has become bigger and it has essentially pushed our content somewhere to the middle. So margin is the space around the box. So if you're looking to push your content, you're looking to create space around it, use a margin. Now we said padding is the space within the box. So let's give H1 a padding. Now, if I refresh this, I expect to see the space within the box to be bigger. So as you can see, because we gave it a padding, it means the space, we said the padding is the space inside of the box itself. So we give it a padding. Now we can see that the space inside of the box has become bigger. It has essentially squeezed our content inside the box and created space. So again, just to repeat, margin is the space around the box. Padding is the space inside of the box. So the main things you usually have to understand is that everything, whenever you type like a paragraph, whenever you type anything you type, your browser sees it as a box. That is the way your browser is looking at it, or that's the way your browser has been set up to see what you have put. So it sees it as a box. Now, margin is the way we control the space outside our box. Padding is the way we control the space inside of that box. Now, the next thing is the border. So the border is essentially the markings of your content. So that is our border. So that's where our content starts from. So the box, this is the beginning, this is the markings of our box, and we call that the border. So the border is the markings of your content. Now I give it a border here just so that we can see. Normally you don't see your border. If you want to see your border, you can give it a border. So 3 pixels is how thick I want the border to be. Solid is if I want it to be a line, and black is the color I want to give it. So usually you see where most people are programming, because sometimes it can be confusing to see where your box is. People usually give everything like a border so that you see. So for example, if I undo the changes I made here, let's leave some of them. All I'm doing is I'm giving all of them the same styling. So I'm giving all of them a border. So this is the way you select multiple things to give them a styling. You use a comma. So I'm selecting all of this just to give them the box. I mean, maybe just so that you can see that everything we write, the browser is seeing it as a rectangular box. Now I'm giving it a border just so that we can see the actual markings of the box, because without the border, you just have to imagine it. You don't actually see it. But when you give it a border, you can see that where your box is starting from and where it is ending. So if I save this and I go back into the browser, so as we can see, all our elements are being rendered as a rectangular box. Now, normally, if you don't put the margin and stuff around it, you wouldn't see that it's a box, but I'm putting this there so that we can actually see it. Any questions? A few minutes just so that you can process it. But if you have any questions, throw it in chat. So just to reiterate, every element is a rectangular box. Whether you see it, I mean, you can't always see, but you can always put a border around it. But every element is a rectangular box. And our elements essentially have a margin. So the margin is the space around the box. The border is the markings of the box itself. The padding is the space within the box. The height is how high we want our box to be, and the width is how wide we want our box to be. So just to also show, I mean, maybe when we talk about display, we'll talk more about height and width. But I hope this makes sense. So just to always remember that everything that you're writing is a box. So sometimes the way, if you're trying to position it or you're trying to move it in one direction or the other, just remember that it is a box. So if you want to move the box itself around, you would use a margin. If you want to move the things within the box, which is the content, you will use a padding. And if you want it to be very, very tall or very high, you use a height. If you want it to be very wide, you use a width, but not to worry too much about that for now. So just always remember that everything is a box in CSS. Okay, so this is just like a pictorial thing of what we spoke about. So the margin is the space around the box. The padding is the space within the box. This is our content. So our content's height, our content's width. So if the bigger our padding, the bigger the space inside the box will be. The bigger our margin, the bigger the space outside the box will be. And the thing about margin is, let me show you an example. Sorry, so I was quickly throwing up two spans. I just wanted to show you what the margin was doing. So I put two spans. I put a box 1 and I wrote I am box 1. Then I put another box 2, I am box 2. So now if we go into our browser, so we have box 1, box 2. Now just so that we can see the box itself, let me give them a border. Okay, just so that we can see the box. Okay, so we can see box 1, box 2. We said the margin is the space around it. Now what happens is that when I give this a margin, I'm increasing the space around it. So usually what will happen is it will push away the other box because it's trying to create a bigger space. So first off, let's give it a padding because we said a padding is the space within the box. So we expect that if we give it a padding, the space within the box should be bigger. So there should be more space in the box. So as we can see, the space within the box has become bigger. Now, if we were to give it a margin, we expect that the space around it should be big. Now, the way it usually creates space around it is if there are things around it, it'll push them away just so that it can create more space. I'm only giving the margin to box 1. So like we said, margin is the space around it. So we expect that it'll be trying to create a bigger space around it. Now, as we can see, it has created a bigger space. And by creating the spaces, that's intent shifted the other one. So that's one of the things you have to know about margin. Because it's trying to create a space, it will push anything around it. It will push it further just so that it can have the space that you need. So, I mean, the box model might not entirely make sense right now, but the only thing to remember is that in CSS, everything is a box. The way your browser sees all the content is a box. Now, the way you control the space within the box is by using a padding. The way you control the space outside of the box is to use a margin. In turn, you can also control how high and just whilst we're here, you can control how high or wide it is. So let's use this example. Let's try and make our H1 maybe taller. So H1. So we're trying to make our H1 higher. So we expect that it will become taller. I mean, so as we can see, so we can give it a height. So again, that's how we control the height. And we can also control the width. Right now, it's almost the full page, but we can make it smaller. Oh, sorry. So the one thing you have to know is that for your CSS, everything is a box. The space around your box is the margin. The space within your box is the padding. How high it is the height, and how wide it is the width. So as you can see, we've made it. At first, it was covering the whole thing. We'll learn why it was covering the whole thing as we go on. But then we can control how wide it is and we can control how high it is. So any questions before we do one last thing before we take the break? Okay, so now the next thing we want to talk about is display. So essentially, there's a reason why, even though I think it's a box, there's a reason why it's either spanning the whole width of the page or it is not. So for example, if you can remember when I did the span, before I give it, and quickly, maybe let me take off the margin. So when I did the span, you can see that the span is not covering the whole page. It has only taken a small portion. Whereas, for example, this H1, and also let me take off the width. You can see that these ones are spanning like the whole width of the page, whereas this one is spanning like half. Maybe not even half, maybe a little. Now, the reason why it is doing that is because of what we call the display property. Now, all elements have a different way by which they are displayed, but the two main ones which we'll focus on in our time together is block and inline. So elements can either be displayed. I mean, there are several ways by which an element can be displayed. I mean, if I'm going too fast at any point, please feel free to alert me or stop me. Now, the first one is a block level element. So essentially what a block level element means is that block elements, they span the whole width of the page. So in this example, we can see that this one is spanning the whole width of the page. So we would say it is a block level element. So what block elements do is that they span the whole width of the page. Now there are some examples of block level elements. We've used most of them. So for example, a paragraph, a header, footer, sections, all those ones are block level. So what that means is that if you have a paragraph, it will span the whole width of the page until you control how you want it to display. So the default is for it to span the whole width of the page. Now the next one is an inline. So an inline means that it's just spanning with the amount of space it needs. So it doesn't take up the full width. So just so that you know, this, it doesn't even matter. So if I only had one letter, because it is block, because H1 is a block level, it also span the whole length. So for example, if I deleted everything and I just left make, it won't change how it is displayed. It will still take up the full space. So if we refresh this, even though we have just a single letter in it, you can see that our box is still covering the full, almost the full width of the page. This is because the H1 paragraph, all those ones are block level elements. So regardless of the amount of content you have, it's still spanning the whole width of the page. Whereas inline elements don't do that. Inline elements are the opposite. So inline elements, let me hide this thing. Inline elements, it just spans the amount of space you need. So it can wrap the text. So for example, as we can see in this example, in our span example, we can see that this is taking just what it needs. So it means that the more text I add, the wider it will become. So maybe if I added lorem 30, this is just like random text. So if I added more text, I can see that, and let me just comment out the other one. Let me just comment out this. Now we can see that because it's having more content, now it is spanning wide. Now we can see that it is breaking to the next line. So that's what we say here, that inline elements can wrap. So if it needs more space, it is willing to go to the next line. So inline elements can wrap. It can wrap without disrupting the flow of the paragraph. So it will go to the next line if it needs to. But if it's just small content, it will just occupy the width of the content in it. So the main thing is that block elements or span the whole width of the page. Inline elements or just wrap if it needs to without disrupting the flow of the page. Any questions? Okay, I know it might be a lot because this is the first time we are hearing of all these things. But just to recap so that we take the break, the first thing we learn is that everything in CSS is a box. So you have the margin, you have the padding, you have the width, you have the height. And the next thing you have to know is that the way that those elements are displayed is based on if it is a block level element or an inline element. Block level elements, like we said, they span the whole page. So it means a box will span from the left to the right. So it'll cover the whole page, regardless of even if the content is small, like we see. In this one, we have only make, but we can see that the paragraph is still spanning the whole page. The box for the paragraph is still spanning the whole page. Then we have an example like the span, which is an inline element. So that one, it will just cover as much of the space it needs. So that is one thing to note when you're using block level or inline elements. And just to unwrap this, so the thing about inline elements is that if it sees that there's a space next to it, it will just go up and occupy that space. So for example, as we can see, this span is not going to a new line. It has seen that there's space here, so it's moving to the next space. Now with this paragraph, even though you can see that there's plenty space, it just went to a new line because it is a block level. It also wants a full width. It doesn't want to take up house space. So those are the two main display properties that you should know for now. I mean, there are a few more that you will learn as you research and as you look into stuff. Does this make sense? Let me know before we take a break. I mean, today we'll take a 7 minutes break because it's a lot. So let me set up the timer. But if you have any questions, please let me know while I set up the timer. Okay, so we'll take a 7 minutes break. I mean, walk around. If things don't make sense, don't sit down, don't code. I'll see you all back in 7 minutes. Then we'll do some coding. Yeah. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Just before we continue, let me know how you're feeling about what we've spoken about so far. Would you like me to go over anything? How are you feeling? Yeah, you can show it in chat. Let me know how you're feeling about what we've spoken about so far. Do you need me to run over anything? Okay, cool. Okay, so just before we go, let's look at a few things. So there are different display properties. So essentially, when we say a display properties are how your content appears. So we said how everything is a box. Now, there are different ways by which we can specify how our content is appearing, and that is the display property. Now, we've spoken about how we have block level elements and we have inline elements. So by default, paragraphs, headers, all those things are block level elements, but then we can change the default. So we said when we say it is block, it means it's spanning the whole width of the page. Now, there are times when if you don't want something to span the whole width of the page, you can change how it is. And the way you do that is by using what we call the display property. So there are different display properties. The one we just quickly want to talk about is, let's talk about the inline. We spoke about how spans are inline, so they don't occupy the full width. Now, if we have a paragraph or if we have a header and we don't want it to occupy the full width, we can also change them to be inline. So the default for them is block, but then we can change the default by specifying what display we want. So in this example, let's change the paragraph to an inline. So now if we change it to an inline, let's see what happens. So now we can see it is not occupying the full width. Now all of them they see that there's a space next to another one. So they are moving, they are moving, they are moving. Everyone is trying to occupy the little space around it. So you can, even though paragraphs and headings are by default block, you can always change the default by setting your own display property. And let's do the same for the span. So we said the span is a block, but let's change the default. So let's make it a display block. And we can see that the span will try to occupy the full width. So like we can see now, the span is occupying the full width. So by default, you can change how an element appears. And the way you do that is by using the display. Now, there are also different ways you can display things. Now, the one that I quickly want to talk about is flex. Now, essentially, flex can be very confusing sometimes. Before we had HTML5 and we have currently we're on our third version of CSS. So the CSS we use is CSS3. Now, before there was CSS3, we used to use something they called float. And float is before floats, there was table. So if you wanted to position something to the left or the right, you had to use a table. Then there was float. Float is very, when I had to do float, it was like tedious. So I don't want to put you through float. You can learn floats on your own time, but now the way we usually position things is that we have what is called a flex. So flex is the way we position things two-dimensionally. And when we are using flex, it's essentially when you have an X and a Y axis, like the way we have in, and let me just annotate that so that we can see, or let me just do a whiteboard. So annotate. So essentially, when we are positioning things by flex, we have an x-axis and we have a y-axis. And don't be afraid, there's no math involved. And flex allows us to position things on either ends of this x or y-axis easily. So let's take the example that we have. By default, when we set things to be flex, we position them next to each other. So for example, we have we have this H1 and this H2. Let me put them in a parent so that we can see as though they are together. Control X section. I'm just putting them in a section so that they are grouped together, because right now they are just separate. So if I have these two elements by default, because they are block level elements, they are all spanning the full width. Let me just give this a class of section. But then if I want them to be next to each other, what I can use is what we call flex. Come into my CSS. I'm giving them a border so that we can see the two different ones. H1. I'm giving the H1 a border, and maybe I'll give the H2 a different border so that it's distinct. So border, 3 pixels solid, maybe red. So by default, we know that this one, they are supposed to span the full width, but because we've given it a display flex, now they can sit next to each other. So when we want things to sit next to each other, one of the things we can use is by using a flex. So by using a flex, we've positioned them next to each other. So display flex is the way that you can get things to sit next to each other. It's the easiest way we use now to let things sit next to each other. And I mean, flex comes with different things. So for example, we have justify content. So justify content is, we said it's an X and Y axis. So how we want the thing to be on our X axis is the justify content. So for example, if we wanted there to be a space around the content on our X axis, we use a justify space around it. And sorry if it is getting very mathy, let me know. So space around, we're giving it a space around on our X axis. But the only thing, I mean, I just wanted you to remember is that there are different ways. Most elements come with a default display. So like we said, the H1, it came with a default display of block, but then we can change the default display by setting our own display property. There's so many display properties, we can't go over all, but then the one you primarily use is flex. So if I do display, so we can see there's display block, there's flex, there's content, there's inline. There's so many display properties. There's table if you want to go back to the olden days. There's so many display properties, but the one you primarily use is flex. And you use flex if you want things to sit next to each other. Okay. Does that make sense? Kobna, I see you just you go here. Does that make sense? Do you need me to explain anything?
Hello, I'm following.
Okay, great. So just to run it back, by default, every element has the way it is displayed. Most elements, their default is either block or inline, but then we can change that. The way we change that is by setting our own display property and giving it whatever we want to give it. Okay. So just to, I mean, there are so many display properties. I don't want to, I mean, it's very impossible that we can run over all the display properties. But then the one we will use mostly is flex. I mean, the one I use most is flex, because flex is the easiest. There's one which is great, but that one is a little more complicated. So flex is what we use. And usually use flex when you want things to sit next to each other. So for example, let me find an image. Because most times on websites, you see images sitting next to each other. I don't know what image. So football. I just want an image. Okay. So let's say this image, let me just copy this image URL. That is if my internet will load. So let me copy this link. So copy image link. So let's say we had in our HTML, we had an image. And like we said, we can have images. We can add images by using the image element. So, and the way we link to what image we want to use it by using the SRC. So let's say we had an image and our SRC is what I just copied, which is very long. Yeah, it's freaking long. What? Yeah, but that's the link to our image. So we have this, and let me just take away the display. So if I save this on our page, so on our page, we have an image and we have a heading. Let me just give it a heading. Wow, but this is so long. I mean, let me find a shorter one. This is too long. It's bugging me. Why is the link so long? Copy image. Okay, I guess this is better. So let me get rid of all this. And okay, I guess this is shorter. Okay, great. So if we have this image and we have a text, so let me put this text. This is a paragraph about a random football picture we found on the internet. Okay, now the image has disappeared. I guess let me just download an image. So I just want to show how we can put things next to each other and how we can position stuff. So let's say football image. I don't. Okay, I didn't want to download an image, so I just copied the link. Hopefully that link is not small. So if we open our browser, I can close this. Oh, I mean it worked. Sorry. Let me just undo. It took a while, but I guess this link was working. Okay, so we have an image and we have a picture. Now, if we want to position things next to each other, so this is our heading. This is a paragraph about a random picture we found on the internet. Now, if we want to position this next to each other, the way we said we can do that is, example, we can use a flex. Now, for us to be able to target it, we've given it one parent. So we've put this and this in a section. And we've given the section a class of section. I mean, how creative. So if we target that section and we see display flex, essentially what we are saying is that we want the section to put all the students next to each other. So if we refresh, we can see that the paragraph has gone next to each other. Normally the paragraph is block element, so it will try to occupy the full width. And let's try and make the image smaller just so that, let's say image. And the way you make images smaller is by giving them a width. So let's say the width is like 100%. Oh, it's still big. Let me give it like 20, 50%. So now by giving, and let me take off the display flex so that we see how it is before I give it the display flex again. So let me cut this. Now, by default, we can see that the paragraph is trying to occupy the full width. The image is trying to occupy the full width. And if I give the paragraph a border, we can see, where's the paragraph? Oh, sorry, A2. Oh, sorry. If we give the A2 a border, we can see by default, the paragraph is trying to occupy the full width. Now, the way we position things next to each other, so we're saying that shift and let somebody sit next to you is by using a flex. So by using a flex, what we can see is that now instead of occupying the full width, now they are sharing the space. So this one has shifted, just occupied as much as it needs, and it has let somebody sit next to it. And we said if we wanted to move them, so for example, if the whole box was two, and let me just give the section also a border so that you can see, we said everything in CSS is a box. So let's say 10 pixels, solid, maybe green. We can see that the parent itself is also a box. So everything is a box. Now, if I give the image to a box, you see that the image to the way it has been displayed is it's been displayed as a rectangular box. So everything is a box. Now, this is the main thing. This is the box. And the content within it is two different things. So they are individual box. We said that if we want to move things inside the box, we can use a padding. So for example, if we wanted to shift the things inside, we can give them a padding. Let's say maybe 20 pixels. So as you can see, it has shifted a bit, and maybe just to make it more visible, let me give it a bigger pattern. Sorry, how do you say? Okay. Okay, so just to see, make it even more visible, I'm giving it a bigger pattern. So as we can see, the space within the box has become bigger. Now, if we wanted to move this whole section, wanted it to come even further more down, we said the margin is the space around it. So I give around the box, I give it a margin. So I give it like 30 pixels. So as you can see, the box itself has moved down. Any questions? Okay, so I mean, we're shaping up. We're coming to the point where we're learning how to be able to position stuff the way we want them to be. So unfortunately, in real life, if I want a picture frame to be somewhere, I can just grab it and like take it there. Now we are learning how to be able to do the same thing in coding terms. So how to be able to put things where we want them to be, how to be able to get things to go in the particular place that we want it to be. I mean, right now it's a lot. It's a lot of new things that we are learning. But let me just quickly run back everything. And hopefully you have had a chance to read, but a week ago, what we assigned was getting to know CSS. So it talks about the box model and also display. So if you haven't had the chance to go over that, this will be a good time to go over that. So essentially, the things that we've been covering today is we've been covering display properties, and we've spoken about the difference between a block level element and an inline element. We said that block level elements means that it's spanning the full width of the page. So from left to right, it's spanning it. Sometimes spanning the full width of the page. Inline elements are not spanning the full width of the page. They are usually spanning as much width as they need based on the content they have. And then they always sit next to each other. So for example, if you had two spans, they'll try to move next to each other. Even if there's small space card, they'll try to fit in that space. Now we said that we can change the display property. We can change the default by giving it our own display. So for example, if the default is block, we can change it from block. If we want them to sit next to each other, we can give it an inline or whatever. Now quickly, let's do this. Let's do this. This might be helpful. Let's quickly look at BBC's homepage. Sorry, I always go to BBC because I don't know any website. It's not like I read BBC too. But let's just quickly, I just quickly want to show something. Then we'll try and replicate it, then we can run off. So like we can see, BBC has these things. By default, we know that when we write HTML, it is in a straight line. So how can we get these things to be positioned next to each other? So let's try and live code it right now. So let's change our title to BBC website and let's code it live. Hopefully it makes sense. So the first thing we can see is, I mean, we won't try and do everything like the search and stuff, but we can see, let's say this is the logo and they have like a sign-in button, but let's do like the main thing. So let me just annotate the things that we want to do. So we want to do the logo. We want to do the logo. So this is the logo. Then they have some sort of nav items. So these are probably like the links. You click them and it takes you somewhere. So we have the links. Sorry. Then we have a sort of input, but this input is to search. So I mean, we know how to do input, so we can do that. Okay, so we've mapped out our site. Now the first thing we can do is, we said that let me clear this annotations. I thought it would stay, but I guess it didn't stay on. It didn't stay on the BBC website. Let's follow us here. So that we can see. Okay, so we when we're doing HTML, we said that usually the thing at the top part of the page is our header. So I mean, not to spend too much time on going over why we are using header. So we assume that that is the header. So the thing at the topmost part of the page. So this will be a header. So everything else will fall in our header. Now the first thing we can see is that they have a logo. So let's say we don't have time to do the logo. So let's just do an H1 and call it BBC. Then we can see that they have links. We learned how to do links. So let's say, and it's a navigation. So we'll just put that in a nav. So let's say a navigation, and not all caps. Let's say a navigation. And at any point, I'm looking at chat. So if you have any questions, so let's say we have a navigation, then we have a list. We looked at list. So just to quickly live code, so that I don't spend too much time. I'll just use shortcut. No, not here, like this. Okay, no problem. Let me just, so the list with an anchor tag. So let me just copy this and duplicate it 3 times. If you don't understand anything we're doing, but these are things we've covered in our previous classes, so I don't want to spend time going over it, but happy to answer any question. So essentially, this is a list. We are thinking of this as a list: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's a list of 8. Oh, sorry, I was talking the whole time, but I was muted. So I was saying that, so we have this logo. I mean, we don't have time to, I mean, I think I can download the logo, but just to not waste time, I'll just write it. Then we have this links, but essentially it's a list. it's a list which are linked. So when you click on them, it takes you somewhere. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We have 8 links. Then we have this search box. I clicked on it, it's taking me somewhere that I don't want to go. Oh, sorry, I'm typing. I'm typing. So I'll just look at what I'm typing. Okay, so all I'm trying to do is I'm trying to replicate the list they have. So I'm just copying what they have. So 1, 2, I mean, it was 8. I guess the last thing is culture. So let me just add culture. Okay, so we have all that. And the last thing they have is some sort of search box. So let's just add that. Okay, great. So we are just trying to see how to position stuff by looking at a real life example. So with the BBC website. So currently, let's see how our website is looking. Okay, close enough. So currently, this is how we have our website. So like we were saying, by default, when you write things in HTML, it lists them, I guess, vertically. So we are learning how to position stuff. But I mean, I just wanted us to use a real life example. Hopefully it'll make sense. So as we have listed, we can see that and we're just doing the navigation. I mean, afterwards, if you want to position the pictures and stuff like that, you're free to go ahead. So essentially, we've done the top part. This is our logo, and maybe let me remove the border so that I mean, I can get rid of all this. We don't need it. So essentially, this is how our beautiful BBC website is looking. We have our logo, we have our list, and we have our thing. Now, the first thing we can see is that these things are seated next to each other. And like we're learning right now, one of the ways we can get things to sit next to each other is by using a display flex. So in this example, we have a header and it has 3 children. One, which is the H1, the nav, and the input. Don't be confused. These ones are all the children of the nav. So all these ones are nav. So the 3 main children are the H1, the nav, and the input. And if we go back to the BBC website, we can see it's almost the same thing. There are 3. We can, when we look at it visually, we can see the way they are grouped. We can see that there's something separating them. So we can tell that this is one child. This whole thing is another child. This is the last child. So that's the same thing we are trying to do. So we have 3 children. I mean, this nav has more children. Now, the first thing we want to do is we want to get these 3 children, 1, 2, 3, to sit next to each other. So we said we can use a flex. So their parents is the header. So if we go to the header and we're using element selectors, if we do the header and we do a display flex, we expect them to sit next to each other. So hopefully they work. Okay, great. There we go. Now we can see that now they are sitting next to each other. They are sitting next to each other. By default, we can see that now it is not trying to occupy the full width of the page. And that's something that comes with Flex. It is not occupying the full width of the page. But the first thing we see is that they are sitting next to each other. Now, thankfully, we can get them to sit next to each other. I mean, the way we do that in Flex is. But first of all, another thing I just want to show is we can see that this children in the BBC where they are also in this family, they are also sitting next to each other. So again, as you guess, we can also do a flex for that one. So we look for who their parent is. So in this example, their parent is the UL. So we can target that as it's the UL. So we can target that and give it a display. I mean, if everything doesn't make sense right now, I mean, try and pay attention when you ask questions, when you're done, try and watch the video again. So we can see that now they're all sitting next to each other, even though there is no space. Let me just give them a little space so that we can see them. But now we can see that the children are sitting next to each other. So like the way, so we are saying that the way we get things to sit next to each other in CSS, we can simply use float. Hey, sorry, no float. Float will kill you. But we can use flex. So as we can see, by using flex, we are getting the children to sit next to each other. So in example, we've gotten the flex to sit, the children to sit next to each other. Now, the first thing we want to do is we want them to occupy the full width because as we can see, the website is the header starts from here and here. So like we said, one of the ways we can do that is we can use a width because width is one of the properties that comes with the box model. It specifies how wide the thing is. So we spoke about width, spoke about height, we spoke about padding and margin. So width is how wide it can be. So we give it a width of 100%. Let's see if that does anything. Okay, so as you can see, I mean, even though we have given it a width, it's still not occupying the full width. Now what we can do is let me just do this then. I can quickly explain. Line items, center. Okay, great. So essentially, what we are doing is we are saying that we said that when we do flex, we have an axis. So by doing justify content, we are saying that the content should spread on the x-axis. It won't make sense right now, but it's something that eventually will come to you. So when we say justify content, when we do a display flex, we are saying that the content should spread evenly. There should be equal space between them on the x-axis. So now it's spreading them equally on the x-axis. That's why now we have the thing. Now, first of all, the one thing I want to ask is, how did we say that we can give a space around? Like we can see in the BBC website, the parents, and let me just give the parents a black background so that I can ask this question. So let's say this is the parent. So let me give it like a background of black. Then let me give like the text color white so that we can still see. Okay, so like we can see, now we can see that, let me clear this annotation. We can see that by default, there's some space. There's some space at the top. Now that is a browser default. So by default, your browsers already have, because we said everything is a box, by default, your browsers have margins and paddings that they have. So usually if you don't want to get confused, you can use the all selector. So when I do an asterisk, it means I'm selecting everything. Then I can give like a padding 0 and a margin 0. So all I'm saying is that I want to start afresh because everything is a box and my browser already has some margin and padding, it can be confusing because now I don't know where the margin is coming from. So I want to remove all the margin and padding so that now I can give it my own margin and padding. So by doing this, now I've removed everything and I'm doing it myself. I've removed all my browser defaults. And let me quickly clean this things. Okay. So like we said, when we want, so this is the black is the parents. We've given it a background of of black. So the parents is what has all these children. Now, how did we say that we can move the things within the box? So now we want to give a space within the box. Like we can see in the BBC, there is some space inside the box. So everything is not by the side, like the way ours is by the side. And does anybody remember how we can give a space within the box? Feel free to type in chat if you can't talk. Let me just do a placeholder. What does the BBC have? And guys, I mean, small, but we're getting somewhere. So search. Because a few weeks ago we couldn't do this, but now if we understand even a little, that's progress. Yeah, I mean, previously, I mean, I'm saying if everything doesn't make sense, that's fine. Because a few weeks ago, we couldn't do this at all. But now, if you understand just a little, that's progress. Because a few weeks ago, all this wouldn't have made sense. So we said that the way we can move things within the box, thank you, Governor, is to use a padding. So if we come into the parents, this is the parent, we give a padding, we expect that it will move the things within. So let's give it maybe a 20 pixels. So we expect that now it will give it some space within the box. So like we can see now there's some space in the box itself. So padding is the space. Now if we give it a margin, we'll expect that it will move the box itself. So let's just for demonstration purposes, if I give it a margin, I can see that the box has moved. So the margin is space around the box and padding is space within the box. In this BBC website, we don't have any margin around the header. So now we've been able to do this. Now, first of all, before we started, this thing was lined up. And just to also, by default, let's have these bullets. But if you don't want the bullets, you can always remove them. So the way you remove them is you target the list and you do a, so this is our element for the list and you do a list style none. So that's how you remove the bullet. By default, all bullets. So like we're saying, there are some browser defaults. For example, there's always margin and padding on everything. So you remove them and give them your own thing. The list items also always have a bullet. So if you don't want a bullet, you just do a list style and you do none. And that should get rid of the list style. And by default, links. So all anchor tags, these things, we said links are things that we can click on. By default, all links are underlined. So as we can see in this example, our list is underlined and it has a purple color, but you can remove it. So if you want to remove it, again, the way you do that is you target your anchor and you do text decoration is for underlining. So you do a text decoration none. Then, I mean, let's change the font color to maybe white. Let me just type white. Okay, so this is just removing someone. So there are things that are browser default. So list styles, the default margins, you can always remove those things if you don't want them in your design. So by default, we've been able to sort of replicate the BBC websites. I mean, in a quick breeze. So just to recap, I mean, we said that the way we can get things to sit next to each other. And I mean, if you don't remember how this was before we did the flex, I mean, let me take away the flex. Let me take away the flex here too. If I save it, we can see that things are just sitting horizontally. But if we want things to sit next to each other, we said we can use the display flex. And there's so many things that you can do with flex. I mean, we don't have time to cover every single flex possibility, but just most times the way you use flex is when you want things to sit next to each other. So this is a beautiful head. I mean, if you want to be fancy, I'd advise that you try your hands with the pictures and try to get them to sit next to each other. With what we've learned, you should be able to at least get close to letting these things sit next to each other. So any questions, please? Okay. Okay, so we have like 20 more minutes, but what I like to do is I like to give you the rest of the time so that for anybody who hasn't had a chance to read the Learn Layouts by Shehao, and no, haven't had a chance to read layouts.com and this one by Shehao, you can use the rest of the time to read. I mean, you understand more about the box model that we're talking about. You understand more about how we get things to sit in a particular way. I mean, like we've done right now, it wasn't hard for, I mean, we were able to get through quickly, but it probably doesn't fully make sense. It's something that you might want to watch back, take your time, slow it down, just see how we were positioning things and stuff like that. But also when you read, I mean, I always advise that you read the resources we share because it'll give you more details. And you always go to the MDN because there's so much that we can cover in 2 hours. Obviously, so much that we can cover in 10 weeks, but this is to like give you at least 70% of all the things you need to know. Then it's up to you to top it up. So any questions before we run off?
Please, my question is it advisable to do it on replay?
Yes, most times you would use Flex. I mean, right now, at least most developers I know, they use what we call Grid or Flex. But most times, Flex is what you use because Flex is easy. It's easy to get things to sit next to each other using Flex. I mean, when I started coding, I was using Float, but Float is like the only time I've cried when I was coding was when I had to use Float because it was so hard to understand. So most times you would probably be using Flex or maybe Grid. Yeah. At least for now. Yeah. So yes, to answer your question, yes, it is advisable. I mean, the recommendation is either use Flex or Grid, but really it depends on what you want to do. If you are doing two-dimensional things like this one is essentially, we don't have a lot of things sitting next to each other. We use Flex. But if we had like so essentially Grid is like different boxes sitting next to each other. So if we had multiple things sitting next to each other, then maybe Grid will make more sense. But Flex can do almost all the things you will need to do. Okay. I mean, I don't want us to get fancy before you see I would have coded the whole BBC website. But I mean, it's something that if you have the time, try. Try. I mean, the more you try, the more you learn. I mean, we did this in like under 10 minutes. It will take you probably more, but the more you do, the easier it will get for you. And you learn how to position stuff. Essentially, at the end of this class, you should sort of know how to position things next to each other. That's one of the things that we have learned. And like we said, usually if you go on a website and you do the inspect, you can see like the code and you can see like what they are using. If you come in the inspector too, you can sort of, and when you click on this thing and you highlight on something, you can click on it. So we can see they have a UL, which is on other list. They have LIs just like the way we did it. Then they have like the LIs inside, exactly like the way we did it. I know that is in the header because we said the header is at the top part of your content. So essentially, most of the things we are learning is how every website will code. I mean, it's obviously a little more sophisticated, but then what we are learning is like exactly how you do most things with a little more sophistication. But this is what you need to know. So yes. You can see for their links, they used an inline block. We've spoken about inlines, we've spoken about block elements, we've spoken about text decoration. So for example, if I remove, I can remove some of the element they have, but if I remove their text decoration, oh, this is for, sorry. If I remove their text decoration, let me try and make this bigger. Let me inspect this one. Sorry. I usually use Chrome, so, but I wanted to see. Yeah, so you can see for this one, they are using a flex. So for the BBC website, they are using a display flex to position things. They're using flex to position this thing. So I mean, it's advised you can use flex for most of the things. So yes, you can use flex. Okay, so thank you all very much. Just to recap the things that we have done for today. I mean, we've spoken about the syntax. We've spoken about how to select things. So you have the selector, then you have what property you want to give it. So, I mean, you don't know all the properties right now, but it's something that you learn the more you can. I mean, I know these things because I've used them over and over, but the more you use them, the more you know that if I want to change the color of my text, I'll use a color. If I want to increase the space within the box, I'll use a padding. If I want to increase the width, I'll use a width. So the properties just come the more you use it. But we know that the way you start things is you have a selector, then you have the property and the value. We've learned about the different ways we can select them. We can use elements. I mean, in most of our example today, we're just using the element name because it's not, I mean, we're just doing a simple thing. So, but if we are like a lot of H1s, if we had plenty H1s, we wouldn't want to just target them using the H1 because then, I mean, we might have another H1 or A2 where we want it to be a different color. So maybe we might give this one a class of logo because this was our logo. Then we'll use the dot logo to style it. So that's how you target things to style. You can either use the element selector, you can use the class selector, you can use the ID selector. So this is an example. Hopefully, at least that makes sense. We've spoken about how CSS cascades. So just to show you a quick example. So you see I have a header and I have a background black. So if I came down here and I targeted the same header and I gave it a background green, because CSS cascades, it will choose the last thing because it's read from top to bottom. So by the time it gets to the end, if I have a different thing there, it will use that. So if I go now, instead of my header being black, it will read the last thing I gave it and make that my header. So if I go back to our BBC website and I refresh, we can see that now our header is green because CSS cascades. So it's reading it from top to bottom. So something at the bottom can override something at the top. So that's something that you always have to be mindful of. That's why you most likely use like classes and things like that, just so that you don't let one thing override the other thing. Yeah. Yes, I mean, we've spoken about display, we've spoken about block level elements, we've spoken about inline elements. We said block level elements, they cover the whole width of the page. Inline elements, they don't, they just cover as much space as they need to, and they sit next to each other. And we've spoken about how we can change the display property. So if we don't want something to occupy the full width, we can change the display property. And we've looked at how we can use display flex to let things sit next to each other. So sorry, let me just keep on sharing my screen so that people's names don't show. So yeah, I mean, thank you all for joining. I hope you learned something. I mean, as always, if it doesn't make sense, watch the video back, read the resources, and just take your time and go over it. If you have any questions, as always, you can put it on the class page. And yes, I hope we are learning something. I hope you are seeing the progress. I mean, things might not move as fast as you wanted to, but just know that a few weeks ago, you didn't know all of this. So, I mean, if you know a little more than you did a few weeks ago, that's just progress. So thank you all for joining. And unless anybody has any questions, I would end class here. And also just so I'll share the resources just so that you can read it before next class. It's highly advisable that you read the stuff just so that it makes more sense for you. Thank you for joining. I'll stop recording now.